Okay, and national security. The president, and we'll actually go into presidential powers here as well. President is commander-in-chief. Congress declares war. The president, though, makes war. Only Congress can declare war through Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The changing nature of war, though, has almost made the power of Congress obsolete. President is the chief strategist, although Congress controls the money. The War Powers Act in 1973 was an attempt to force the president to seek congressional approval before making war. It limits the president to 10,000 troops for 60 days, with 90 days to withdraw troops unless Congress grants an extension or declares war. So moving into the presidency. So let's look at powers of the president, which come from Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, powers of Congress come from Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Powers of the president, the executive branch, come from Article 2 of the Constitution. The four areas we're going to look at are national security powers. The president is commander-in-chief and the chief diplomat. Administrative powers, chief executive. Legislative powers, chief legislature. And judicial powers. So, national security powers. As commander-in-chief, Congress declares war, but the president does make war. As I said before, the changing nature of war has made the power of Congress obsolete. The president is the chief strategist. Congress controls the money. Presidents generally have support at the start of a conflict. Congress in 1964 passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to give president the broad powers to commit unlimited numbers of troops for an unlimited length of time in the Vietnam conflict. It's before things started to drag on. And then the War Powers Act of 1973 was an attempt to force the president to seek congressional approval before making war, which limited the president to 10,000 troops for 60 days and with 90 days to withdraw unless Congress grants an extension or declares war. The Supreme Court has never ruled on the War Powers Resolution. Chief diplomat. So the president handles foreign policy. They make treaties with other nations, although it is subject to a two-thirds ratification in the Senate. Because Senate ratification is sometimes difficult to achieve, the president does use executive agreements, which do not require Senate approval. The president nominates ambassadors to other nations with the agreement of the majority of the Senate, and the president is the ceremonial head of state. They receive ambassadors of other nations, thereby conferring diplomatic recognition of other governments. Number 2, administrative powers. As the president as the chief executive, they enforce the laws and they take care that laws be faithfully executed. They nominate government officials, cabinet members, executive office members, with approval from the majority of the Senate, and they manage the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the many parts of government and people who work in government that actually put the policy into place. The cabinet. It's not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It's a group of presidential advisors. Heads are called secretaries, except for the Department of Justice, whose head is the Attorney General. Each cabinet secretary is appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate. They may be dismissed by the president. There are 15 departments in the cabinet. Homeland Security was the most recent one. Executive Office of the President, the EOP. All right. Helps carry out the president's administrative responsibilities and day-to-day operations. There's 3 main offices. The National Security Council, NSC, headed by the National Security Advisor, has direct access to the president in matters related to military and foreign policy. Unlike State Department, largely free from congressional oversight, a favorite institution of presidencies. The Council of Economic Advisors, they are economists who help the president make economic policy. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, they prepare the U.S. budget. They are very, very powerful. Now remember, with all this right here, the president still has the final say. Next, other offices. Office of Policy Development, U.S. Trade Representative, Science and Technology, so on and so forth. Okay, the White House offices, the president's closest advisors. The chief of staff is the top aide to the president. This person manages the executive office of the president. They can determine the effectiveness of a presidency. Other key members are the press secretary, speechwriters, legislative liaisons, national security advisors, and many more. And you can turn to page 413 to see that. Number 3, legislative powers. Power as the president as the chief legislature. Must brief Congress on State of the Union, which we see every year, letting Congress know, we get to see it, how the country's doing, their vision for the country. They can suggest legislation to members of Congress. They can veto any bills that come out of Congress, which then have to be overridden with the 2/3 override, which is very difficult to do. It is difficult for the president to advance his legislative goals during divided governments, when one or both houses of Congress is controlled by the opposition party. This slows down the policymaking process drastically. If you have a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, it's much easier to get things through. But if it's divided, if you have a Republican president and a Democratic House, it makes it much harder, because if the Democrats pass a law and the president is a Republican and doesn't like it, he'll veto it. But to get that 2/3 to override his veto is very difficult. All right, judicial powers. The president can grant reprieves and pardons. They can also nominate federal judges who are confirmed by a majority of the Senate. Senatorial courtesy. Nominations for state-level federal judicial posts are not confirmed if they are not approved by the senator from the state in which the nominee will serve. This helps the president because there are too many positions for him to truly research all the nominees. So, impeachment. Congress can remove the president for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The House of Representatives, they impeach the president with a simple majority, and it's easier to do than actually removing, because for the Senate to remove the president requires a 2/3 vote. So if you hear impeach Obama or impeach Trump, impeaching is one thing, but removal is a much different thing and much, much harder to do. Bill Clinton was impeached, but he was never removed from office. Vice President. The main constitutional responsibility is to replace the president if he or she were to die or leave office. They also serve as president of the Senate, which means that they break any ties that might be in the Senate. More recent presidents have used the vice president as a partner in their leading of the country. As I said earlier in the last video, if the president were to die, then the vice president would take over. If he were or she were to die, they would be the Speaker of the House, then the President pro tempore of the Senate, then the Secretary of State, and it goes on down through the cabinet. The president and the media. The president uses the media to act as the agenda setter for the nation and Congress. The media sets the tone, they set the agenda. The president has often had a relationship of conflict with the media in recent years. The media often reports on presidential approval ratings. These often go down over the length of a president's term or spike high or low when major events happen. President Bill Clinton's rose over his 8 years.